Hello, and in this video we're going to break down Waves HEQ. HEQ is part of the Waves hybrid series. This is a hybrid EQ, meaning we're using some of the best features of analog and combining them with some of the best features of digital processing. However, things like mid-side processing and very narrow cuts and boosts available on digital EQs are often not available with their analog counterparts. HEQ looks to blend the functionality, taking the best of both worlds. Firstly, let's break down the interface. The top section here features a frequency analyzer as well as a solid orange band through the middle. Now, the solid orange band displays our current EQ curve based on the settings and performance of our EQ band. The yellow frequency analysis is the input signal being fed into the EQ. When we have an adjusted EQ curve, we'll see a separate output curve as well. This allows us to see with a visual representation what frequency areas have been adjusted on the fly. A control that's not immediately obvious, but we are able to zoom in and zoom out ever so slightly, visualizing the EQ curve slightly differently. We can do this by clicking and holding on the 0 on the left-hand side and scrolling with the mouse. This way we can see a more detailed adjustment of the EQ curves taking place. Across the bottom of the frequency analyzer, we have our full range of keys. And something that's beautifully useful about this EQ, and the reason that I use it at some point in most mixes, is that with each key, we can see its fundamental frequency. For example, the purple key here is currently linked to the low frequency, and we can see that it's set to 87 Hertz, and that would be the F2 key. If I was to change this to the F sharp in the second octave range, we'd see that frequency shift to 93, being exactly the fundamental frequency of that key. It's a very useful mixing tool for mixing exactly specific notes and knowing where the ranges are for specific things. And then the visual representation of each band being linked into that specific frequency is also very useful. Just below here, we essentially have the on-offs for much of the analyzer representation. We can do show entirely and remove it, just displaying the EQ curve. We can equally turn in and out off separately, and we can also separately see left mids or right sides depending on our current mode for the EQ. We also have freeze and peak hold options. And with peak hold here, we get a ghosted visualization of the peaks in any particular areas. This can be useful for spotting jumps in frequency. For example, here around the 550 sort of area, we have this big spike that wouldn't be necessarily visually there when we've paused the analyzer. Looking at our main interface, and we'll go from left to right. We have two separate sliders here on the left-hand side, and these are our input signals, and we can obviously control left and right separately, or if we switch on this little icon here, the two will always be linked together. Holding option and clicking will always reset to 0. To have the controls unlinked in mode, we need to switch off link, and we can now control our left and right in and out independently. If we were to use the link control again, they do not snap to each other, but instead work logarithmically based on the current values. Again, holding option and clicking will reset them to 0, and we can link them back together. Speaking of the mode section, we have mode in stereo, and by default left will be selected, but while in stereo, the left channel will always affect both as they are linked together. If we unlink them, we can obviously work on left and right independently. Now, left and right will currently have been mimicked as they were linked, but if we select right and perhaps remove our lower mid frequency here, we can see that we now have our orange EQ band and a green EQ band representing the opposite side. If we were to switch the mode from stereo to mid side, right becomes sides and left becomes mids. If we wanted to solo a particular aspect, we can have sides here selected and select solo, and we'll now only be able to hear the sides of the track. Now let's go over our EQ modules. These are set out to be very like an analog EQ, but they have some of the modern luxuries we're used to as well. Firstly, high pass and low pass are disabled by default. Selecting the icon just here next to HB or next to LP will engage the high pass and low pass. We have a selection of different types of high pass and low pass, with the US vintage, UK vintage, etc. going right the way through. And these cover a variety of different sought after analog EQs, but are unofficially modeled, hence their naming. Digital 1 and 2. Digital 2 is the only one that allows an adjustable Q control on its roll-off. All the others have a preset cutoff value based on their analog counterparts. This also includes Digital 1. It has a preset, what appears to be a 6 decibel roll-off. And the same applies for the low pass. The frequency can be adjusted via the control on the GUI at the top or via a slider at the bottom here that has the frequency. As with many Waves plugins, we can simply double click and enter a desired frequency and it will snap to that point. Below the frequency is a Q adjustment. As discussed before with the high pass, Digital 2 is the only one that has a Q adjustment, allowing us to do a very steep roll off. The low frequency and high frequency bands are able to be switched between shelving and bell, and this is just done next to the LF icon or the HF icon, and we see we've got a shelf by there by default, but a simple click will engage it into being a bell. When the bell is engaged, we also have access to the Q control for that parameter. And if we have a look at some of the different curves that we have, if we do a low boost here, you can see with the US vintage, our Q control is actually very limited in what it does. It simply zooms in on the frequency area, creating more of a harsher boost, but doesn't affect too much its wider range. This varies depending on each curve, and each curve is going to give you a slightly different performance option. For example, the UK vintage changes drastically between its sharp and wide Q values. Again, Digital 2 is the one that allows us to do the sharpest of cuts. Most of the analog cuts are very mild by comparison. Digital 2 allows for that very harsh digital cut. And like with the input values, we can hold Option and click to reset all default values. The low mid-frequency and high mid-frequency are all fixed bell curves. They cannot be switched into their shelving counterparts, and they have access to the same different range of curvatures as the low frequency and high frequency. These do not change with the shelving options. Curve is, however, applied to the shelving style EQ, allowing for different flavors depending on what we're after. Each band can be soloed. So if we take our low mid frequency here, and right at the bottom of its control, we have this icon just here, and it will solo the band we're working on. And this can be a nice way to really hear the difference in the bands as we change through them. Especially at the lower Q values. And all of the ranges here go from -18 to +18 dB. And remember, we can zoom in to get a better look at what's going on with those EQ curves. As before, we can also double tap to type a value just by double tapping on the icon, and something like -6 will give us a -6 cut here. Moving out of the EQ section, we have analog. Now, by default, analog is off. We have the analog sound and feel for each individual vintage EQ. When we choose it, they have a default level of 100%. Level controls the amount of analog noise added, and THD controls the level of harmonic distortion. So with some curvatures applied, the harmonic distortion based on that can be adjusted. So if we take our noise level to 0 and we play the signal back, we can slowly increase the harmonic distortion based on each EQ curve. as you heard there, we can take that to ridiculous levels of 1000%, which very much distorts the signal. However, we can use it to add character, and somewhere around the 250%, we start to get quite a nice, almost analog feel with the distortion being added. The THD distortion will also change based on the analog value being used, so the analog unit in place. I'd advise that you try these yourselves. The noise level can equally be pushed up, but only to 200%. And on a busy, hot signal, it's very difficult to detect. Last but not least, we have our output section, which functions almost identically to our input, except has two functionality difference. We have a phase inversion for the left and the right independently, so we can check out EQ changes being made independently, left and right. We also have trim, and trim will automatically reduce the output based on the EQ adjustments. Notice how trim hasn't adjusted the output, but has instead adjusted the input coming signal. And that, guys, is a breakdown of HEQ and how it functions. My biggest bonus of using this is quite simply the snapping of frequencies to particular key ranges. I find this incredibly useful for mixing low end and making sure that the EQ is exactly on the fundamental I'm after adjusting and balancing out. Especially when we've got one particular note in a performance that sticks out in a mix, we can find that particular note, land right on it, and EQ it out in moments with relatively accurate precision by using the digital EQ. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Thank you for subscribing to the channel, and I will see you guys on the next one.